Okay, so we've been discussing the buildup leading to the issuance of Executive Order 9066, which occurred on February 19th, 1942. And of course, that led to Japanese internment. And let's remember that even before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Americans were fearful of a war between Japan and the United States simply because they fully recognized the repercussions that they would face if it did occur. Uh, they were aware that they would not be trusted, that they might even be sent to prison. And indeed, Pearl Harbor was their worst fear realized. Now, as we discussed, they were sent to these assembly centers at first, and while they were there, uh, they were building the camps, the concentration camps, more inland. And if you look at this map here, the triangles designate the areas where you see 10 concentration camps that would hold Japanese Americans. Now, you might notice here it says WRA. So this refers to the agency known as the War Relocation Authority. So basically what happened is once the Japanese were sent to the assembly centers, well, the Department of War, if you remember, was handling this whole thing. They came up with the idea of military necessity overriding the Constitution, and their job is done. Now they could hand it over to a civilian agency, and the agency that was created for this purpose was, as mentioned, the War Relocation Authority, otherwise known as the WRA. By the way, this was headed by the brother of the General Dwight Eisenhower. And, of course, Eisenhower would become a president. So the brother of Milton Eisenhower was in charge of this. And he openly dissented, by the way, to the inhumane treatment of Japanese. He recognized the unconstitutionality of internment, but they wilted under pressure, as most others did, because it was felt that the Japanese simply could not be trusted. So it's important to show that, the nuances here in terms of the race relations here. It's not all of, so to speak, white America being against Japanese Americans. Okay, now, you see the War Relocation Authority, again, in charge here. And they are building the concentration camps. Now, this brings up another issue. Is concentration camp, quote unquote, an accurate term? Well, first of all, the president did use that term at the time, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He used the word concentration camp. The military, the War Department, preferred the term relocation center. And then this would be appropriated by the WRA. They call it relocation center as well. This is a euphemism again, because we don't want to use the term concentration camp. But indeed, it was that in the generic understanding of what a concentration camp refers to, which is to take an entire population of people and to concentrate them in one area only for whatever purpose you may have. So if you look at that strict sense, absolutely, the term concentration camp is appropriate. However, it would be erroneous to say that they're analogous to the concentration camps that we're familiar with when it came to the Nazi regime and, their imprisonment and their extermination, right, of Jews and other populations in Europe during World War II. So definitely do not draw that comparison, okay, because those were death camps, and the concentration camps housing the Japanese are definitely not death camps. So we should make that clear here. Now, another thing that we should address here is, did the Japanese engage in wide-scale protests once Executive Order 9066 became official? did they go out in the street and demonstrate against the violation of their constitutional rights? After all, that's as American as apple pie, so to say, right? If your constitutional rights are being violated, then you go out and protest. In fact, our country has its origins based on protest. You know, if you're familiar with the Stamp Act or the Tea Party or what have you. Not to mention more recent events like the Civil Rights era, the Civil Rights Movement. So it seems that the Japanese Americans are completely justifiable in wide-scale protests, yet they did not protest en masse. So the question is, why didn't they protest? Why didn't they resist? Why this open cooperation? Why no, again, riots in the streets and wide-scale protests? Well, they were fully aware of what message that would send. Okay, should they engage in wide-scale protests? In other words, they're aware that, you know, once this image is put forth before America at large, before most Americans, well, it would only highlight the degree to which the Japanese Americans were being unloyal or disloyal, that they weren't following the law, because this is a law. Executive Order 9066 is a law that must be followed, must be obeyed. And, you know, any citizen or just resident of the country, well, you're expected to obey the laws if you're a good citizen or a good resident. And therefore, if they did not comply, if there was no willful compliance to this law, it would only reinforce that notion that the Japanese could not be trusted, that they are indeed, quote unquote, perpetual foreigners, that, you know, they're really Japanese and not Americans. Of course, the community members realized this, community leaders, and therefore it was widely agreed upon by Japanese, with some exceptions, okay, who they didn't necessarily protest, but what they did is, individually not report to the Assembly Center or decided to challenge the law, right, which we'll discuss in a second. But again, the Japanese Americans en masse did not protest because they understood that this would only reinforce that image of them as being untrustworthy, as possibly being a fifth column, and as being disloyal. And it would reinforce this idea that, you know, they are not American. So they did not engage in protest. And this could tie in with another argument that's going to be made here. And that argument is this. By willfully complying to Executive Order 9066, by openly cooperating, well, this is a demonstration of their loyalty, right? The Japanese Americans knew that, hey, hopefully, by us demonstrating before America that we are indeed cooperating with the law, that we are complying to this directive issued by the federal government, that it's showing how loyal we are to the United States, and that we are not pawns of the Japanese government. So hopefully you can see that argument, how that's connected with no wide-scale protest, right? All right, so with the completion of the concentration camps, otherwise known as the relocation centers, on this map here, the triangles, and notice, you know, there's far east as Arkansas here, and most of them are in the Midwest or the eastern regions of California. And it's interesting to note they had to be taken away from the West Coast because they felt, that is to say the WRA and the War Department felt that there are crucial military installations and factories there that if the Japanese were indeed a fifth column, well, they could commit acts of espionage and sabotage there. So take them away from the West Coast and move them inland, and hence this region. You know, it's interesting, this region here is known as the Great American Desert. You may not be aware that the United States has its version of a desert, okay? But it's not a desert like the Sahara Desert, but it's desert-like conditions, and this is known as the Great American Desert. So here is where many of the Japanese found themselves, and still today this region is known for being sparsely populated, and the inclement conditions for habitation. But again, it served as a strategic area to house the Japanese. And here they are. They get moved to these regions, and let me remind you, they're concentration camps. There are barbed wires all around, so you can't escape. There's armed guards 24 hours a day. There's floodlights, so people could see at night who's trying to escape. And by the way, there were some isolated incidents, not a lot, but isolated incidents of some Japanese who tried to run away, and they were shot and killed. But it didn't happen a lot. But nonetheless, that just shows that you don't have freedom of mobility, obviously. Okay, you can't do what you want. You are stuck there, even though you didn't commit a crime, even though you didn't have any trial before your imprisonment. So what was life like behind barbed wires for the Japanese American? Well, as we noted, it was not a story of resistance, but of survival. They're again placed in these camps, surrounded by armed guards constantly. Most of the places were overcrowded and barely suitable for human habitation. All the detainees or the prisoners were assigned places, specific places in the barrack halls. Often these spaces were too small for families with children. The people in the camps slept on army cots, not comfortable beds. Of course, there's no furniture, no running water, though they did have electricity and some stoves, but no individual kitchens like they had at their comfortable homes before imprisonment. Everyone ate at a dining hall, and by the way, almost everyone complained about how bad the food was. Of course, the bathrooms and bathing facilities were minimal. There were some supply stores around that were set up in the camps. But let's remember that if you didn't have the wherewithal to withdraw your money before you had to report to the assembly center, well, you lost all your funds. They were frozen. But despite these horrible conditions, at least there were attempts by the Japanese Americans to form a semblance of community. For example, there were jobs available inside the camps to earn a little bit of money. There were teachers, janitors, doctors and nurses, and others. But, for the most part, they were underpaid for these jobs. And you had some schools set up. You had libraries, hospitals, churches. So, you even had a community government set up, where they elected people to these positions. But for the most part, according to testimony, life inside the camps, surrounded by barbed wire again, and armed guards, and floodlights, and such. Well, this was a life of tedious boredom, of psychological depression, knowing that you lost everything that took, years, if not decades, to acquire. Sometimes family fragmentation, because it didn't happen a lot, but some families were separated. Some family members were separated for some reason or another. So if anything positive could be derived from this, it was a time where the Japanese could assume roles that they were denied to them outside the camps in dominant society in the United States, like teachers and community leaders, or even like in a school athletic team or yearbook editor. They really didn't have those possibilities as Japanese Americans outside the camps.